Gospel Tangents is supported by users like you. Please support us at gospeltangents.com or on Patreon. We're doing a throwback episode with Shannon Flynn. Shannon worked closely with Mark Hofmann, and you'll probably recognize him from his big role in the Netflix film Murder Among the Mormons. Shannon's going to share his dealings with Mark here. This was filmed several years before Murder Among the Mormons. You'll notice his voice is different. Unfortunately, after this interview, Shannon got lung cancer, and as part of the surgery for the lung cancer, it messed up his vocal cords, a nerve or something. Unfortunately, he passed away, and he's no longer with us. But I thought it would be fun and interesting to do this throwback episode where he shares some very interesting stories. Some of them aren't even in the film, Murder Among the Mormons. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Well, welcome. I'm excited to be here with Shannon Flynn. If those of you remember my Kurt Bench interview from a few months ago, Shannon knew Mark very well. And so wanted to talk a little bit about the Mark Hofmann bombings with Shannon and talk about his relationship with him and, even how Mark beat the polygraph test, which I think is going to be an interesting thing. So what I'd like to do to start out here, Shannon, is just tell us how did you get acquainted with Mark in the first place?
Well, I had a real interest in church history, doctrine, theology, that sort of thing. And I had met a person named Lynn Jacobs. We went to the same singles ward in Rose Park. And at that time, probably 1983, Mark Hoffman's name was very common in the church history circles and that sort of thing. And I am not sure how Mark and Lynn ever met, but I met Mark through Lynn Jacobs. I was introduced to him, and so I think I had met him towards the end of 1983.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay. So I'm trying to remember. It seems like Mark, you were just showing me a document there. He said that he started his forgery crimes, I think, in 1980. So he was well underway when you met him.
Well, significantly so. And actually, that's kind of an important point. One of the things we were looking at, he actually started forging coins first. And his first coin forgery was when he was 12 years old. And I believe the first time he ever uttered a forgery, in other words, other than just something for doing himself, was when he was 14 years old. And he had learned through a process of trial and error how to add mint marks to legitimate coins. And so he would buy a legitimate coin, maybe a penny, something that had no mint mark on it, and then was able to put a mint mark on it that would significantly increase its value. So the penny was real and legitimate. The only thing that wasn't was just that little mint mark. And as he described afterwards, in the interviews and so forth that he had done with the county attorney's office, that's the way he got into the Mormon document world. It was from coins to Mormon money to Mormon documents and then to American documents. So it was kind of a natural progression through there. But he had been forging stuff for a long time. And that particular process of adding that mint mark, it's actually a real piece of metal on there and it's electroplated on. He told afterwards how he did all that. And it's kind of a complicated process. Nevertheless, the important part here is that the bulk in numbers of his forgeries was actually in coins. And to this day, probably 90% of them have never been discovered.
Oh, really?
And probably never will.
So he said, because he started this doing it at 12, was he selling them back then for more money?
Well, eventually that took place. And like I say, I think that was when he was 14 that he first uttered, or in other words, sold a coin. Though, as if I recall this correctly, the first forged coin he ever sold was to Al Rust, but he sold it as a forgery. The only thing that Al Rust didn't know is that 14-year-old kid standing in front of him was the one who had made the forgery.
So he went to Al and said, "I've got this forged coin."
No. He said, "I bought this coin at a coin show, and it's very, I'm really thrilled with it." Al Rust is a very nice person, very caring, and he liked to help people in the coin collecting world. And so here was this 14-year-old kid, and he thought, that's fine. He had no suspicion, but he took it in the back, and Al maintained, and I don't know if he still does, a whole collection of coin forgeries to use as exemplars so he could, check it to see.
Oh, I see.
So he took it in the back and got his eye loupe out and looked at it. And he came back and he said, "I think there's something wrong with this coin." He said, "The mint mark doesn't look quite right." He said, "I can't tell how it's attached because that trick had been tried before, but they would glue it on, but that would leave a little edge that you could see under magnification." And he said, "I can't see any edge, but the shape of it is just not right." And he actually felt sorry for this poor kid because he figured that he had gone to some coin show and gotten taken by an unscrupulous dealer. And so he said, "I'll buy it from you." Probably not for what the real value of it was, but at least so, and he was trying to encourage the kid to not just, this is a terrible hobby and I'm going to quit and never do it again. Like I say, the only thing he didn't know was that kid forged it.
Wow.
But what that told him was, my technique is almost right, but not quite. It started a chain of events that throughout his life, Mark has been incredibly lucky. He could have been caught many times before he was, but he just kept getting lucky over and over and over again.
So did basically Mark keep going to Al Rust and improving his technique essentially until he bought something that he thought was legitimate that was forged?
Right.
Oh, wow.
And then he was kind of home free because then he could be a coin dealer, and he did. I'll try to get it to you somehow. I have one of Mark's business cards when he was a teenager, and it says coin collector, and the name of his business was Mark's Mint Mistakes. And what he dealt was his anomalies, things that were misstamped, misprinted, and that's kind of a subset of the coin collecting and paper money collecting world, and that's what he specialized in. Well, what he really specialized in was buying a $50 penny and turning it into a $1,000 penny, or a $25 silver dollar piece and turning it into a $5,000 silver dollar piece.
Yeah.
And I can just take a second here. There's an easy way to detect that forgery. If you put that coin on a block of dry ice, it cools the coin very quickly, and that little mint mark will flake off. Well, the reason I said that most of his forgeries will never be detected is because those things now in the ensuing years have been bought and sold all over the United States. And since there isn't really a pedigree so much for them, I guess you could come up with it. I bought it from this dealer, and, you could probably figure it out. Some of those would be so terribly complicated, no one's ever going to do it. But the simple solution is for any collector to take all of his coins and put them on a block of dry ice. They don't want to do it.
Nobody wants to do it. That would be a pretty inexpensive way to figure it out, right?
Well, but then that coin you paid $5,000 for is now worthless. And that just says something about the way the world is and the way things work to a huge extent. I bet there's some collectors that have done that, but my estimation is most haven't, and they don't want to know.
Wow. So that's interesting. So you said you met Mark in a singles ward. Can you tell us what it was like?
Lynn Jacobs.
Okay.
I was in the same singles ward as Lynn Jacobs, and so we became friends. And then sometime after that, he introduced me to Mark, and then we became friends also. And then eventually, I started working with Mark more and more. And then for probably 6 months before the bombings, my full-time employment was I didn't work for Mark, I just worked with him.
So what are some of the things that you did with Mark?
Well, by that time, the volume of his forgeries was getting so big that it was starting to cause some questioning. And so what he did, unbeknownst to everybody, it's always unbeknownst to everybody, he would start shuffling off or kind of shunting off some of his document dealings to other people, so that it didn't look like that he was constantly selling everything. So, as an example, Lynn Jacobs was the person who dealt the salamander letter. Mark Hofmann never did. It was always Lynn Jacobs. He was the one who said he found it, and he was the one who approached the church, and he was the one who approached Steve Christensen. It was never Mark.
Huh? I thought he had a meeting with President Hinckley. Is that not?
Well, he did meet with President Hinckley, but not on that particular document. People had confused that over the years, and it's just, they're just not paying attention to the details. It was always Lynn Jacobs, and he did that, and he told Lynn, "I'll pay you to do this. I'll give you a part of what we get." But what we didn't know is he was trying to make sure that it wasn't him that was coming up with everything. So one of the things that I did with Mark is he had several items for sale, and he wanted to sell them to a collector and a dealer in Las Vegas. Well, I was the one who flew to Las Vegas, offered the items, sold them, got the cash, brought it home. And I did that on a trip to New York one time also.
Now, New York was where he found the Oath of a Freeman. Is that right?
Well, that was a story he concocted, and it was very ingenious because, and
now, just in case people haven't listened to my Kurt Bentz interview, tell us what Oath of a Freeman is.
Okay. Very important document, and if the legitimate one is ever found, it will be incredibly expensive. It is the first known printed document in what is now the United States of America. A printing press was brought from England over to America, and it was operated by a guy named Stephen Crane. And he was the first professional printing press printer in the United States. The first item that he printed was a single sheet of paper called the Oath of a Freeman. The fourth one is actually known, and there are copies available, and it's called the Bay Psalm Book. But that Oath of a Freeman, very interesting, because what it does is it was printed for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it is a way for the people that were participating in that Massachusetts Bay Colony, that religious organization, to essentially sign an oath of fidelity to the new group and say, "I'm here and I'm part of this group." And so it starts out I, and then the letters A-B, which are supposed to be for your name. And you say, "I will follow the rules of the group." And I'm just very paraphrasing it. You can find it and read it. And the interesting part is it said nothing about England. So it turns out, in a strange way, it is the first seed of revolution.
Well, it sounds like an Oath of a Freeman. It sounds like it would be related to the revolution. So
well,
anyway.
at any rate, so what happened is this interview could go on a very long time. What happened is Mark had been to an auction in New York, and on the way home, he was reading through the Sotheby's auction catalog for an upcoming auction, and one of them was a book that was going to be offered for sale called New England's Jonas Washed Up on London Shore. It's not that impressive a book, except that there is a text of the Oath of a Freeman. Since there are no known copies of it, nobody knows exactly what words are in it. But from that book, he was able to come up in his own mind what he thought that would be, taking that guessed at text and just modifying it a bit. It was a printed item, but in order to sell that, he needed to come up with a provenance. He couldn't say, "I found it on the street," or no one would believe that, I mean, he had to come up with something that people would say, "Oh, okay." So what he did is he went to a gigantic bookstore in New York called Argosy Books. And they have a whole section of pamphlets. And they, at least in those days, they were just loose. You could just kind of go through them and, 1, 2, 1 through 3, like that sort of a thing. Well, what he did is he took in a piece of paper, and it was actually a poem, but on the top of it, imprinted, what said the oath of a freeman. And he looked at Argosy Books' numbering system that have a little letter set and then a price. And so then he took that back to his hotel room and in pencil wrote the correct numbers on it, went back there, slipped it in, walked around for a period of time, I don't know, 10 minutes, an hour, who cares, doesn't matter, goes back, pulls that out, goes to the front desk, and with 3 or 4 other innocuous items, a $10 book or something, I don't know, but I'm just, $10 book and another little pamphlet or something, I'll take these. So he gets a receipt. ABC grammar book, Oath of a Freeman, $25. I got it at Argosy Book.
Mm-hmm.
There's the provenance. And it was a tremendous one because investigators, of course, afterwards went to Argosy Book and said, can you tell us anything about this? Oh, are you kidding? There's thousands. There's hundreds and 1,000 pamphlets and broadsides and sheets and sure, because that's our receipt, and that is a legitimate receipt, and they can find the cashier that wrote it. That's all true. Where did we buy that from? Who knows? How long have you had it? Who knows? So it just disappears in the mist, but as far as he's concerned, it is now out of his hand and to a legitimate source.
Wow, that's amazing. So you didn't have anything to do with that transaction at all? It was that was all him?
No.
What were some of the things you were doing in New York?
Well, he was a substantial collector of children's book and ephemera. In fact, that's where a large amount of the money in the last 2 or 3 years before the bombings, he was making a lot of money, and people have always wondered, well, where did that money go? It went to these children's books. And and the excuse was, he said he was buying it for his wife. And that kind of made her feel good, But he was buying just premium first editions of Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Call of the Wild, Alice in Wonderland, Wizard of Oz, and he was paying, $15,000 for this book and $8,000 for another book and $20,000 for another book. That's where the bulk of that money.
So he was building up his own legitimate library.
Very legitimate library. And so I would travel with him sometimes because sometimes he would carry cash. And so I was actually the one that would carry the cash. I mean, I've went to New York with $15,000 watered up in my pocket.
Oh my gosh.
And there was one dealer, Schiller and Wapner, who we dealt with all the time, and they were very friendly with him. And at the same time, he would go to auctions. And so I went to an auction at Sotheby's one time and saw the Emancipation Proclamation, one of the copies, the 13th Amendment, being sold. And if I recall correctly, I know one of the people I'm sure of was the bidder. It went way past reserves, and it came down to 2 bidders. One of them, I believe, and I'm going to say this, I believe, because I just can't be 100% sure. The other bidder I know for sure was Malcolm Forbes, and he was the one that eventually got it. He was bidding against, I believe, Ross Perot.
Oh my goodness!
And it was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were making $50,000 jumps at each bid, and you could tell that Ross finally thought, this is stupid. And from the look on Malcolm's face, he didn't care.
Wow.
He would have kept going until he got it, and he got it.
Wow, that's crazy. Okay, so he had a big interest in children's books. So that is what happened. All the money did that get liquidated after he went to jail?
Actually, before.
Before.
And let's see, I'm going to try to say this nicely. Not everyone that dealt with Mark was disappointed in the transactions. We only nowadays and afterwards hear about the people that were disappointed because the money was taken. Some people were not disappointed in the transactions because as pressure was building in 1985 and debts needed to be paid and it needed to find ready cash, he found a couple of people that were willing to make him loans and sometimes some substantial amounts of money, $50,000, $25,000, and use those books as collateral. Well, after the bombings and he went to jail, they kept the books.
Oh, okay.
And they made a really good profit.
Oh, wow. So he didn't, well, I know he did, it seems like he did cheat, was it First Security Bank out of $180,000? Or do you know that story?
I know
First
that
Interstate
story.
Bank. Okay.
Intimately. First Interstate Bank. Right towards the end, he was floating around that he had come upon what he called the McLellin collection. There was a possibility that William McLellin, one of the early apostles of the church that became disaffected, had a number of church documents in his possession, letters, things like that, plus his own journals and reminiscences. And after he left the church, they just stayed with his family. That is the idea. And he said that he had found a descendant of William McLellin that still had the bulk of this collection. No one had an inventory of it. So no one knew if it was 20 pieces or 30 pieces or 100 pieces. It was just, quite a number of pieces. But in it was what he described as three just stunning pieces. One was additional papyri from the Book of Abraham, not the three facsimiles that we see, but other parts of that same scroll. And then he had floated around that there was a history produced by Oliver Cowdery. And that Oliver Cowdery history contained a letter written from Emma Hale to, I believe, Oliver Cowdery, describing how the Book of Mormon plates were initially found. And in it, he told people that she said that it was Alvin Smith that went to the grove and prayed, that it was Alvin Smith that actually met Moroni for the first time. And then Alvin died, and then Joseph just took it over and took over the story. Well, it turns out none of that's true. And it was actually Mark who made that whole story up. But you can see why. What could have been something of just passing interest now is of intense interest. Well, Mark was out of money and it had nothing to do with the McLellin collection. And he was in some real financial trouble. And so one of the ways he was trying to solve that problem was telling people he had this McLellin. He had access to it, but he would need money to get it and need to be $185,000. Well, that information was passed on from Steve Christensen to Hugh Pinnock. Hugh Pinnock was on the board of directors of First Interstate Bank and arranged a loan of $185,000 to Mark to take, supposedly, and immediately go and purchase that collection and bring it back. I sat in his car while he went upstairs to First Interstate Bank, came back down, and I saw the document and the check. And that was an unsecured loan. There was a big box, and it was clearly marked unsecured. Well, he didn't buy the McLellin collection. The money went to somebody else to pay off some other scheme he was in the middle of. And of course, that was one of the things that provided so much pressure, because eventually that loan, I can't say this from an accounting standpoint, but it was a somewhat irregular loan,
Yeah.
And they wanted it back.
Oh, so I know Kurt Bench said that he got a cashier's check for $100,000. Do you think that part of that $185,000 went to Kurt to pay off?
Very well could have.
Okay.
Very well could have. And it was in those kind of amounts of money. This wasn't $200 or $500 that you could kind of, you had in your sock in the sock drawers.
So he was robbing for security to pay Kurt. And yeah, because I know Kurt got a call and said that some people were very upset, saying, "Where did you get that money from?"
Yes. Yes.
And very interesting. So tell us a little bit more about Mark. What was his personality like?
Nowadays you would kind of see him as a computer nerd. He was not charismatic in the least. And he kind of had poor social skills. I remember on at least one occasion, going with Lynn, some friends of Lynn, my wife and I, and we're going to have a kind of barbecue dinner at the Hofmann's house, a lot of chatting and so forth. We got there a little bit late. We go in the house, and Mark has already made his dinner and eaten it. You would have thought a normal person would have waited. He didn't know and didn't care.
Oh, wow.
Like I say, he didn't have a lot of, he was not a good host or, those sorts of things. But he was a very personable person. And I don't remember a time ever seeing him. He never suffered from depression or those sort of things. He was not a down kind of a person. And of course, at that time, if you had any interest in Mormon history or collecting, he was the person to know, because he was always in the middle of this thing and that thing and buying and selling. And of course, by the bombing times, he had shifted most of his focus over to Americana. So he was doing relatively little with LDS church stuff. And most of it was over, American sort of things. He had a very nice wife, very pleasant person. And I think at that time they had 4 children. They lived up on the east side of Salt Lake. And what turns out, it was the home that he had grown up in. He had purchased that, or was supposed to be purchasing that from his parents. And so it was a very regular street, Marie Avenue, and, just what you'd expect in Salt Lake City on the east side, and a regular church attender. Gave no indications of really what was going on inside of him at all. He was a master deceiver. He could, and I don't know, maybe he did suffer from depression, but he never showed that. Never at all.
So we talked a little bit about, some people think he's a sociopath or a psychopath. It seems like you said that he's been interviewed by psychologists, and they said, no, that's not true. How do they come to that conclusion? And, how would you describe somebody who kills a couple of people?
Well, yes. He had several psychological exams at Utah State Prison, one of which was done. I don't know if it was just part of the normal process. I would believe that the prison probably tests all the inmates for IQ, because that, of course, would affect how, they're housed and their behavior and stuff like that. But in the particular instance that I'm familiar with, the psychologist wrote up a report, and he was sending it to Mensa, American Mensa, which is the Society for Geniuses, I guess. And he rated him 137 on a particular scale, and he scored the same number on another scale, which he said was above the top 2% in the nation. He was also interviewed by one of the psychologists that did the polygraph examinations, and the psychologist, he was trying to understand how he beat the polygraph, and he said in there that other than his aberrant behavior as far as the forgeries and the deceptions and the murders, he didn't present with what you would consider normal psychological problems. He described him as having a narcissistic personality disorder, but he did not present as a psychopath or a sociopath or schizophrenic or bipolar, any of that sort of thing. And he carried on, and that's one of the things that the psychiatrists talked about. He carried on a very normal life otherwise. He was very kind and loving to his wife and children, and that's not to say he's a great person. I mean, he murdered 2 people, but there was just no indications of that other than he loved to deceive people. And he started that as a young person. He started out his very first, what he feels like his deceptions were doing card tricks and things. He loved to be able to trick people and kind of pull the wool over their eyes. And so that, I think, is where that forgery stuff came from. But then it morphed gradually as a teenager, and then eventually in his early 20s, I mean, after his mission, into it. That's the way he made a living.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just an interesting little aside. The prosecutors, they interviewed him after his plea agreement and didn't record it, but took notes of it. And that was one of their first questions is, how did you do all of this stuff? And he said, well, it's really not that hard to figure. I'm again paraphrasing. He said, it's really not that hard to figure out. He says, what do you do for a living? And he said, well, we're attorneys. And he said, are you any good at it? Well, yeah, we think so. He said, I cheat people. I deceive for a living. I'm good at it. I'm a good forger. And he did put tons of effort into learning that process and understanding that process and refining that process to a level that to this day is quite striking. He actually printed 2 copies of the Oath of a Freeman. One was at Schiller-Wapner, and that's what was going to be sold to the Library of Congress, and then he had kept another one. That copy that Schiller-Wapner had, I believe they still have it to this day. I'm not sure of that. Someone asked them if they could do some forensic testing on it, probably 4 years after the bombings. So at that point, everybody knew this thing is a forgery. There's no question. They took it to the University of California, Davis, and performed some tests on it, and I think they were essentially radiocarbon dating, and that thing came out as a legitimate document.
Yeah. Well, I know that he used to steal paper out of old library books and things like that. So I'm not too surprised.
Or lucky.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to figure out. For example, the Salamander letter, that paper came from the University of Utah in a book called the Niles Register. And in those days, they didn't have nearly as much under lock and key. And so those Nile registers were just sitting out on the stacks. Well, those kind of books, they always have some flyleaf, some empty pages. And so what he did is he went in there with a briefcase, and then he had devised a simple little thing. He'd taken a razor blade and put some tape around it. So there was just a teeny little edge sticking out. And so then he would just take that book to the study carrel where nobody could see him, and he would just very carefully slice out 2 or 3 pages and not bend them, slide them into that briefcase, put the book back. And I don't believe, had this not ever happened, to this day, I don't know that anybody would have ever found that. Because who would take those old Nile registers and leaf through them to make sure all those fly leaves in there? Nobody would. But he picked those because he knew it was the same kind of paper, so he did do substantial historical research to find the same kind of paper. So when that Salamander letter was tested, the paper is real. It is not fake. That is real 1830 paper. Oath of a Freeman, the same thing, except there he got it out of a Bible down at BYU.
Oh, no way.
It was still out in the stacks. Now that one, again, the research is significant. And maybe I should just stop here for just a second, because I'm describing a lot of things and they're very amazing and it's all very interesting. But I don't want to come off ever as not knowing what happened. He is first and foremost a murderer. And that's who he is. and he should spend the rest of his natural life in prison for it. He murdered 2 innocent people that had nothing to do with him and did nothing to him. This cannot be claimed as an act of passion or rage or nothing. They did nothing to him, and he murdered those 2 people. And that really, everyone needs to keep firmly in mind we're talking about a murderer.
Yeah.
But at any rate, the paper for that oath of a free man, there was not paper-making facilities in what became the United States and Massachusetts in those days. So I had to be brought over from England. Well, the paper in those days when it was made, it's made out in sheets and then it's dried. There's these big sheets, and then they put it out on a screen mesh. And as that wet paper sits on there, it makes a little impression. And under magnification, you can see that impression. They call that chain marks, either grid marks or chain mark. Chain marking is the usual way to do that. Well, the Bassalm book, he found a real one. He was able to examine one back east somewhere at a library. And I don't know if anybody noticed, they probably didn't at the time, that he had a magnifying loupe. And so he put that up real close so that he could see what the chain marking was. And of course, there weren't tons of paper manufacturers in those days. So he only maybe had a choice of 10 different papers. Well, he dug around for a long time and found a Bible that was printed in Britain, in Great Britain and England, with that same paper. And you could tell by the chain marking. So as examiners looked at it, that's one of the reasons he got away with it and no one would believe because they were forgeries, is because a significant number of his most important items had been examined by competent, at least we believed at the time, competent examiners. And so, at the time, somebody said, well, this is a forgery. Well, no, it's not, because we've had it examined, and they really had. Library of Congress was not going to buy that thing unless they knew that thing was real. But again, just took the little razor blade, pinched the piece of paper, off it went. And he didn't need to have very many because that was kind of a big sheet, and so he would cut it down and able to, make more than one copy. But the way that he was able to, that thing still beat the test is the paper is real and legitimate. The ink was made to formula, but that ink was not old. Well, how could you test the ink? You could do it by radiocarbon dating. Well, he somehow in his brain figured out to take some of the extra pieces of paper, legitimate paper, burn them, and then mix that carbonized paper in the ink.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yes. So they would find traces of carbon it turns out from the paper that was from 1680.
Wow. That's amazing. Because I've always wondered. Now, it seems like I was reading the book Salamander, and he also had some sort of a technique that aged the ink that also caused it to crack. Was that test done on this Oath of a Free Man?
I don't know that it was, because in this particular case, it wouldn't need to have been oxidized, because the ink, it was of a formula that would not necessarily have turned brown, because writing ink was different than printing ink.
Oh.
And he, again, had done substantial amounts of research on ink formulas. Because people would make ink themselves. So it was possible to buy an almanac or something that would tell you how to make your own ink.
Okay, so this cracking problem was only a problem with written ink. It wasn't a problem with printer ink.
At least with the Oath of a Free Man. Mm-hmm. That may have been the case on some other documents, I don't know. But the particular one, because the Salamander letter as an example, that was written ink. Well, he had found the old formula. And, of course, they use funny words. They use words like gum Arabic, but you can figure out now what the modern day equivalent of gum Arabic is or whatever. But so with the Salamander, we'll go back to that one. The paper is old and legitimate. The ink is the correct formulation. The question is, how long has that ink been on that paper? Has it been there for 6 months, or has it been there for 150 years? Well, the ink that was used very commonly in those days was called iron galvatonic. And that means there was actually an iron compound in there. Well, iron, as it gets old, rusts. So it turns from black to brown. Well, it's the oxygen interacting with the iron atoms that creates iron oxide, which is FeO3, which is rust. So essentially, you got to get that ink to rust. So you got to accelerate that oxidation process. Well, again, he had figured out a way to do that. One of the things he did is to make it look kind of a little older, he would put it in the oven and kind of cook it, 200 degrees, and just let it kind of cook. But the other thing that he would do is he took an old fish tank and got an old electric train motor, one of those dial things, you make the electric train go. Well, if you remember, if you're old enough, when you turn that on, there's a sparking and there's a little smell that comes off there. It's O3, ozone. It's extremely strong oxidizer. So what he would do is take that finished document, put it in there, turn on the thing, put a lid on it, and let it sit for half an hour or so. That O3 would now create the same 150 years of oxidation in 30 minutes.
Holy cow, that's pretty
But what happened is that ink, instead of being able to dry slowly, dried fast. And cracked.
Yeah.
Now, when that was discovered, that was not known. Whoever said that, there was a little bit of trouble at first because other document examiners said, no, this is not a legitimate test. This doesn't mean anything. And so the people that came up with that not only had to figure that out, but had to convince the community that this is in fact a legitimate test because no one had done that before. No one had looked for that and noticed that cracking, or if they had, they didn't ascribe it to anything. Had they not wanted to know that Mark was guilty so badly, they wouldn't have taken the time to track that down. So in fact, as just as we sit here and think about it, that technique may have been used for the last 100 years by somebody else, but no one really ever keyed on it because never has the scrutiny been so big and so intense on one person and one set of documents. Now, from now to going in the future, that's a regular and legitimate test, but that had to be invented
because of Mark.
Because of Mark.
Wow, that's crazy. Now, one of the other interesting things that you told me about was that Mark was able to pass a polygraph test.
Mm-hmm.
How was he able to do that?
Okay. Well, this is the way he was able to do it. He was examined by some of the premier polygraphers in the United States. And it was one of the fellows was from, that actually administered the test was from the University of Utah. And it turns out that when that test is given, there's a paper recording goes on. And so the important part for determining if a person's truthful or not is not sitting at the test, but it's reading the chart. And so then, and examiners will all the time have other people that were not present in the test read the chart, so they're kind of coming at it fresh. So they're not being biased by what they saw or anything. They're just looking at the chart. Well, in his particular instance, it was done by a very competent examiner, and then it was read by 5 other well-known examiners, and they all declared that he was truthful. But the way that particular polygraph works is it isn't like true or false. I mean, what you see on TV is a bunch of hooey. All it does is tests physical responses under stress to questions. And a good examiner will get the person really stressful so that they react strongly physically when they're telling an untruth. And when you hear about the sweating, that galvanic skin response, that's one of them. They will test for that. They'll test your breathing rate. They'll test your pulse. When I had mine, there were 6 different indicators going on. When Mark did his, it was just 4 because it was being done remotely. Okay, well, I mean, the way he was able to beat the polygraph, he had very competent examinations and reads, and they all showed him to be telling the truth. The way that those polygraphs work is they work on what is known as a zero null system. So in other words, they put up a scale and 0 is the center, and then it goes -1, -2, -3, -4, all the way -15, whatever, and then +1, +2, +3, whatever. And so when a test is scored, they will give a number, but the number will be +1 or -3 or +10. And generally, between -5 and +5 is a no reading. They can't tell. The person has been messing with the test, or the examination wasn't done well, or that they can't tell. So it'll be towards the center of that. But then when you get to -10, -11, -12, very untruthful and easily seen. +10, +12, +15. Very truthful. Mark scored a +14.
Wow.
I scored a +12. That really bothered those examiners. When they find out that he had beat that test, it really bothered them. And so it turns out that the main person up at the University of Utah, David Raskin, was able to arrange an interview with Mark when he was in prison about 2 years. Year and a half or 2 years afterwards, because he wanted to find out how in the world he was able to do that. And this is what Mark told him. And he said, Mark presented as very happy, happy as you can be in prison, but, a normal person, and didn't present with, as I mentioned, with a lot of psychological problems. But he said that he did have a very unique ability. And that is, when he was about 13, he went to see a show where there was a hypnotist. And I remember it in Salt Lake. Ravine maybe was his name. I don't know. Maybe some of the listeners will know who this is. But he would come and kind of do shows, Saturday, matinee shows and stuff. And that sparked a real interest in him. And he pursued that for the rest of his life and still does, where he has learned techniques of biofeedback, relaxation, and
hypnosis
and self-hypnosis. And so he told David Raskin that basically what he did was, and evidently through the questions that David asked, well, how does this work and how does this work? He was convinced that he really does know how to hypnotize himself. He wasn't just saying that, because he was able to describe the procedures correctly. He was able to describe how he's able to control, his physical responses. And so David believed that he really can do this. And I guess he did some investigation, because at one point, and Mark told me this some years later, that he was actually able to go to the dentist in prison, have a root canal done with no anesthesia.
Wow.
Biofeedback, relaxation. And he told David Raskin that he had had dental procedures. And he says he was conscious of what was going on, but just had learned to block the pain. So he hypnotized himself the night before the polygraph and then again in the morning, and just told himself over and over again, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, and then describes the test being administered. And when they got to the questions, did you cause the death of Kathleen Sheets? Did you cause the death of Steve Christensen? And there's only a small number of questions. Again, on movies and TV, this long line of questions, that's not the way it works. He was able to not produce any significant physical response to that, and said that he was aware of the questions, but could just let his subconscious come forward that he had convinced hadn't done it.
That's amazing. Wow.
David now believes that his tests are still just as valid, but he believes they're now, and he says because 95% of polygraphs are used for criminal matters, and he says there's almost no criminals who are going to go through that effort. But he says there is now a category that there is a potential problem in, and that is with spies. because they would have the sophistication and the knowledge base to learn self-hypnosis. And that could really become a problem, because in organizations like the CIA, FBI, they routinely use polygraphs to make sure everything's kosher in the system. Well, they would have to now be aware that there's possibility that some of those people that are working as an agent or whatever, or, captured people that have come over from a different country, have learned those techniques, and those polygraphs may not be valid on them anymore.
Wow, that's amazing. So is that why they don't use polygraphs in court as evidence?
No, they don't, because those things are still too unreliable. And they're just unreliable in that there's still that center section that if you're scored a +1 or a -2, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't tell if you're truthful or not. And so that comprises a large enough segment of the polygraph that it just makes them, non-usable. And there's a lot of people in the legal profession that still have real problems with, because when you're entering that as verifiable testimony, you've got to kind of be more sure than that. But like I say, I mean, those things are, and I think when David Raskin says that they're accurate, that doesn't mean that they can always tell truth or not, because there's going to be some in the middles. But what they're saying is where they do get the very high plus ratings or the very low minus ratings, those are 90 or 95% accurate all the time.
Okay, so do you know how many of these are in the middle range, -5 to +5?
I don't know.
No.
I don't know. All right, somebody please go out and do the research for us. And when this appears on Wheat and Tears, write a comment and tell us.
All right. That's great. Okay. So, lost my train of thought there. You said you took a polygraph test. So, and I understand from the book that I read, you actually spent some time in jail.
That is
talk
correct.
About that. So what was that all about?
Well, I was incredibly naive. Maybe still am, but I was incredibly naive and unknowing. And so when those bombs went off, and especially one with Mark, man, I knew him really well, a lot better than almost anybody else did. So I thought I could be helpful. And so I volunteered once or twice to go to the police station and tell what I knew and contribute some information. Well, what I didn't realize is the police were casting a very wide net on potential suspects, and I got caught up in that net. And so at one point, the police, in an interview, had told me they were going to go search my house. And so I said, well, you're going to find something there that's illegal. I said, there's an automatic weapon that's an illegal one that actually belongs to Mark, but it's in a storage unit of mine. And so I was at one point arrested for possession of an unregistered automatic firearm, which appears that's a federal crime under the tax code, strangely enough. And so then I spent 3 days in Salt Lake County Jail, and then was able to get bail and get out, and then never went back. So in that process, I acquired a defense attorney. And I now, at the time I didn't realize this, but he suggested strongly that I do a polygraph. Well, now I know it's because he wanted to know if I was telling the truth. But it could have been helpful to have me excluded. It didn't exclude me for 1 second, because the police were this was a huge deal and a huge crime. And they were not coming up with, just lead pipe cinch suspects very quickly. And so they were just going to do what they had to find somebody. And so that became a charge that I could be charged with, though I was never charged with anything to do with the rest of it. But he suggested I do this polygraph, and he knew about David Raskin. So he said, why don't we do this? And then I will help exclude you. So I said, sure. So we drove up to the University of Utah, and I sat there, and like I said, was all rigged up and had 6 different sensors going and all of that, and $600.
You had to pay?
I paid.
Oh, wow.
I paid. And, I think in my attorney's view, then he believed that I hadn't had anything to do with it. But I'd like to say the police didn't.
They didn't care.
They didn't care.
So the police still thought you had something to do with it?
Somebody. And they didn't care who it was.
They wanted to hang somebody.
Oh, they had to. And so Lynn Jacobs was looked at carefully. I believe Brent Metcalf was looked at somewhat. I mean, but like I say, they were casting that net as wide as they could get it. And it was still, because it all drove from the incredibility of the whole thing. No one believed that any one person could do all of those forgeries and build those bombs and kill those people and all of that stuff. They just didn't believe it. Even if Mark did it, they didn't believe that one person could do it. There must be somebody else involved. And so, of course, they went through the normal police procedures. They found, Confederates, friends, whoever, and they applied whatever pressure they could, because that's a normal investigative technique. Because, often evidence of a crime is not really readily available. A lot of times people are convicted on either witness or complicit testimony. So they were looking for somebody to say, oh, yeah, he did it, and I was there, and,
Okay, so they put a lot of pressure on you. Did they accuse you of being a co-conspirator or something?
They did a number of things that to this day I will never forgive them for. Never. And this plays into a little bit why, for me, this was difficult to imagine. You will be able to show on this some examples of his handwriting, his natural handwriting from his mission, and then from when he was in prison. And when you see those examples of handwriting, and you can imagine that you didn't know that all this had happened, and someone showed those to you, and you say that is the handwriting of a master forger, you'd say, no, it's not. No, it's not, because it's awful. The spelling is awful. The handwriting it's like a child. And that continues to this day. That is not affected. Well, surprise to all of us, that hand did produce, as he admitted, over 86 different signatures. And then long sheets, not just signatures, 2-sided sheets of paper, full letters. But anyway, one of the things that they did is, when I went down to be interviewed, I was just trying to be nice. I ended up going out in handcuffs. My parents came down to the police station to pick up my car, and one of the detectives met them and said, oh, he murdered 2 people.
You murdered 2 people?
That's right.
Really? I bet that went over well with your parents.
Well.
Wow.
And I'm sure that, the guy that did that to this day doesn't care. Well, that's what I believed. I will not forgive that. And then they did something else too. They did a search of my house while I was in jail. We had a storage unit across the street. We had some baby furniture and a few odds and ends in there. They went in there and they believed they had found the bomb factory. And so an agent from the BATF, unfortunately, I don't know his name right now, but I'll come up with it and I will speak his name out now loud, because that man should be made to be responsible for what he did. They had called the news media. All 3 Salt Lake channels were out there, Associated Press, Deseret News, everybody. They went in there, had a big pair of bolt cutters, cut that lock, swung open that door, looked, came out. There was nothing there. And that man stood and looked in the camera and said, the bomb factory was there, but it has been moved.
Oh, really?
Straight out lie. So when they said to me, oh, Mark made those bombs, I said, no, you're lying. Because I've seen you do it before. You've done it to me. I got to watch that while I was sitting in jail up on the felony floor. It was very exciting. All of my fellow cellmates were I was the most famous person in jail.
Oh, boy. So wait a minute. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying there. So you knew that they were lying about you, and so when they said that Mark was the bomber, you felt that they were lying about Mark as well.
I didn't know anything that would be true, and I knew they were fully capable of just out and out lying. And like I say, this wasn't, we couldn't quite tell, or there's a little fuzziness. That's kind of a judgment call. No, straight out lie. And not a lie that was damaging, that said that I did something that was horrible, that was completely not true.
Wow. That would have been very difficult to deal with, I'm sure.
Well, at any rate, so that changed the mean of view. But as a result, and then, of course, his wife, his parents, everybody, he didn't do that because he never presented that sort of a persona to anybody in any way. He was not criminally inclined, You would believe something that somebody had committed an armed robbery if they had committed, 3 or 4 burglaries before, because that's, that, and that's kind of in the same thing, and so you could believe that. Never an arrest, never a traffic ticket, anything. And so they would say, legitimately, from my experience, that can't be true. Well, we're all fooled. It was true.
So you believed he was innocent for a very long time?
For a very relatively long time.
Right. So, I mean, how did you come to change your mind?
Well, the evidence did build after a period of time, but what really turned the key for me was when he pled guilty. Because I knew that, and I had an interview with a reporter, because right after that happened, they called and said, "What do you think about that?" And I said, well, obviously he did it. Because no one would say that unless they did.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it took a long time afterwards to really gain the full belief of that, because then you had to see how he was able to do the forgeries, and, a lot of information had to come to then be believable. But as I've been speaking so far, there's all sorts of things that now we can understand that's true, because you can see how it happened.
Well, so how many interactions did you have with the police? Do you remember?
Oh.
I know. The reason why I'm asking is because I know that Kurt Bench, when I talked to him a few months ago, he said that you, I think it was the day of the bombing. I think it was October 16th, the second day of bombings, I guess I should say, that you and Kurt went to the police station and said, "Hey, I think we know something," and that the two of you came out to your cars and were looking for bombs after to see if there was a car bomb or something. And so,
yes.
And you said,
I was driving a red Audi 5000 in those days, and we had ridden up there together and going back, and we did look.
Wow.
We did look, because it turns out Mark set off all those bombs, but of course we couldn't have believed that. So for us, there was still somebody out there. And Mark's deception plan was working initially, but it only worked until he blew himself up. Because Steve
Which was
Christensen,
just one day, basically, right?
Yeah, Steve Christensen, that was the old, I've forgotten the name of the
Judge building.
Well, he was at the Judge building, but this all stemmed from his business dealings with Steve Christensen, and I'll think of the name of the business, because he had been with Steve Christensen for 4 or 5 years before then. CFS, exactly. Yeah. Kathleen Sheets, it's CFS. But then that night, there was a report about someone being seen in the Judge building early in the morning, and he had on this leather jacket that was gray and green, and that didn't really fit. So then the next day, now Mark's blown up. Well, and I'll tell you, Kurt wasn't able to tell this, but I'll tell you the whole story here. The focus shifted to Mark within an hour of that bomb going off in his car. And this is the way that it happened. Since those bombs had gone off, the ATF had been called in, because that's kind of their area of expertise. And the car was sitting there on the hill behind the Deseret Gym. It had been on fire, not completely, and of course it was still kind of smoking a little bit and dripping and whatever. And when Mark had been blown up, he was laying in the street, and I'll give another little strange. This whole thing is just too weird. There were some people in the area that saw that happen, so several of them run over to him. There was a fellow by the last name of Christensen who saw that, went over, and his shirt, Mark's shirt, was torn a bit, and he could see garments. So he said, oh, that guy's he knew the guy was a member. Pulled out a little vial of oil and gave him a blessing.
Wow.
That he would live. Well, he did live. I'll let you all think about that. He had enough presence of mind that by the time the ambulance gets there, they're questioning him. They said, what happened? And he had regained enough, like I say, presence of mind after having just suffered this explosion to say, a car hit me. A tan van was coming down the road and the car hit me.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well, the ambulance people and the initial police, so obviously he's traumatized but he's concocted a story that doesn't fit. BATF comes, asked the police, who was it? It was this person. Where did you find him? Right here. What was the position? And then said, oh, no, I'm sorry. He told that van story later. What he told the police was there was a bomb in the car, and he said it was over on the passenger seat or something. Well, they told the BATF guy that. He looked at that bomb damage, and he said, that's the bomber right there. Because he knew instantly that his story and the evidence did not match. That's all they had to go on. But that turned the focus that quickly. From that point, they exercised faith. In the classic Hebrews definition, they looked for evidence of things hoped for, assurances of things not seen. And so then he was taken to LDS hospital, put in under a false name, and spent, I don't know, a week or 2 weeks or something.
Well, why was he put in as a false name?
Anybody that comes into those hospital systems that are of a notorious nature, whether it's by crime or they're famous or something, are put under a false name.
Was he famous then? I mean, in the Mormon community, I understand, crime. But it was just a big crime. Okay, so that's why they did that.
Well, the hospital takes for an assumed that he was not the perpetrator, but a victim. And so they don't want to give the perpetrator another chance to finish the job.
Oh, I see. That makes sense.
It's crazy. But somewhere, I'll have to find it. I have his wristband in the name.
Now, that's something that you brought up a little bit before we started recording. So you have like a treasure trove of documents.
Used to. I have a lot of copies, but I ended up selling most of that. But he had received a ton of stuff the first 2 years that he was in prison correspondence, and he kept all of it. And it was so much it couldn't be left there. So he asked his wife to take it all home. 3 or 4 years later, I was at her house. She wanted to get rid of it, throw it away, and I said, I'll take it. So I picked up like 4 garbage sacks of
So papers,
letters, the suit that he wore.
To the court?
Yeah, into prison the day he went in.
Wow. And then his wrist bracelet from the hospital. What are some other things that you've got in that collection?
Well, and I if you took a picture of it, not, we will, but when he was released from his mission president gave him his little picture card that went up on the board, shows everywhere he served, shows his temple recommend that was signed by the mission president for him to go home with. There was just that collecting spirit is strong. And so he, and on all of the letters that he would answer, he has no photocopy there, obviously. So he would rewrite his response to any letter that he sent back. that he sent to anybody.
So he would handwrite a copy of his own letters?
That's correct.
Wow. Because he wanted to have it. Why wouldn't he just copy that?
Has no access to a copy machine. And he had seen that for 10 years before, because that's what people used to do in the days of Abraham Lincoln. That
they would copy their own correspondence.
Copy their own letters.
Because I know in the book, Salamander, it said that he, with a lot of his forgeries, he would show people photocopies. So, I mean, I've wondered, so would he like do some fake forgeries on regular paper? Because I would think it would take some practice to get, Thomas Bullock's handwriting or Joseph Smith's handwriting or whoever. Would he just make copies of that so then they say, well, this is the copy and then I'll get you the real thing later?
Another one of the reasons it took everybody so long to really latch on to this, because again, another thing that's been very misreported, he had this studio in the basement of his house that was his forgery central. The police searched that and found no forgeries. There was papers, there were notes and stuff, no forgeries. And again, no one believed that these forgeries could be pulled off without some tries. They fully expected to find the Salamander letter half done and 3/4 done and a quarter done where he's trying, and then it doesn't work and he crumples it up and tries again, crumples it up, that sort of a thing. He pulled off that Salamander letter in one try.
Wow.
One try. That is the only exemplar. Did that in one go, front and back.
So is that how he did most of his forgeries? Just one try?
Try.
And then because he would to make copies of these things and say, hey, I can get access to this. I need this money so I can go buy it or whatever, when he had it the whole time, right? I mean, isn't that what happened?
Well, no, he would just produce to demand. Because someone would say, gosh, wouldn't it be cool if he could find something? I would love to find something someday from Betsy Ross. You never see anything about Betsy Ross, do you? And that may be true, it rarely comes up, and she's not important in the documentary history of the United States. There's nothing, she wasn't part of the Revolutionary War or a general or, anything like that. She's just very famous from the flag. So that would be a really nice thing to have that's not commonly around. Well, he would sit and go, yeah. And he'd listen to everything he said. And then 6 months later, guess what I just found? Wow! I wish I could find that. If you notice, everything he did was always to a demand or a point. Now, he did forge cut signatures and things like that, just as simple money-generating devices. But the Anthon transcript, man, that's big. That's to a demand. We know of its existence. Martin Harris has talked about it. There were some evidence that there was a part of a copy made, but the actual piece of paper, there it is. Joseph Smith III blessing, same way. Oh, there's council meeting notes about his son being ordained, and years later somebody said something about it, but where's the actual piece of paper? Boom, there it is. And most of his Americana was done to demand also, or to a point. In other words, he especially where he was going to make some money, it wasn't George Washington saying, I had a lovely day and had a piece of pork for lunch at the end. I mean, it's George Washington handwriting, and that's nice. But I hate Thomas Jefferson, and I wish, somebody was shooting. Whoa. So he always produced things that would generate a lot of money, but they were always believable. He knew Kenneth Rendell real well.
Who's Kenneth Rendell?
Kenneth Rendell is famous, in the book collecting world, because he was the person who discovered the Hitler diary forgeries, but he did it from content. The paper and the handwriting all could have worked, but as he examined that carefully, an entry in there I was at Berchtesgaden today and then yesterday and then flew to Berlin that night. Well, when you look at the dates, he looked and that can't work. It was wrong. The history of it was wrong. And so Mark was very well aware of that. So as an example, the Salamander letter, people said, oh, that's going to ruin the church. And that completely goes against, the standard history of the church. Well, it did go against the basic juvenile understanding that most members have of the church. But that particular concept, a salamander or a toad, he actually took from Mormonism Unveiled. And the concept of Joseph being prevented by that, he took it from a Jesse Knight diary. And so at the end of the day, it was new information, more, but down the same track. It would not, and in fact, it's been proved. I mean, it isn't a real letter, but I mean, my heavens, Michael Quinn some years later with Mormonism and the magic worldview, it confirmed every bit of it, not the particular animal but confirmed every bit of it.
Well, and I know that a lot of Hofmann forgeries have ended up in scholarly books. But
Actually not.
Well, because I know it was Dean Jesse that had written something on
the Lucy Mack Smith letter. I've got that right here.
Okay.
That's true. Richard Bushman used in a footnote a reference to one of Mark's forgeries, but very little outside of that.
Well, because it seems like Kurt Bench told me that they had to do, I don't know if retraction's the right word, but issue something with Dean Jesse's book that said, well, yeah, these documents that we were relying on are
footnotes. It was actually a journal article, but that one had to be completely retracted.
Okay. So, and I know in one of Quinn's books, he talks about the Jonathan Dunham letter where Joseph Smith basically said, hey, you need to come rescue me from Carthage jail.
Exactly.
So that one ended up in Quinn's book. That's a forgery that ended up in there. So what about this Mormonism and the Magic Worldview? Were some of the Hofmann forgeries in there? Or are you?
No.
You're saying that?
No, it's just because that book was written significantly after the fact.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, significantly after the fact. But the concepts were all borne out. So this idea of Joseph going on and believing in magic and going on September 21st, the solstice. No, not the solstice, the equinox.
Right.
Equinox. Yeah. And he found out that Mark in that letter, the Martin Harris letter was just giving a little snippet of some magic belief. Well, now we know it's 100 times bigger than that. And so today, those letters, that Josiah Stoll letter about the money digging, of course we know he did that all the time. They would not be nearly as controversial. I mean, by a factor of 100 that they are now.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand what you're saying. So we know that Joseph Smith did money digging, but it sounds like Hofmann came up with a letter saying that.
Well, again, took referenced information and just kind of, just came up with a piece of paper. It was known for forever that he had worked with Josiah Stoll. And in fact, it was because of him working with Josiah Stoll that he was in the Harmony, Pennsylvania area. And that's how he met his future wife.
Emma.
And Joseph said that he tried to convince the old man that he was just wasting his time and money having us digging around trying to find this Spanish treasure. But there had never been the piece of paper. There's an actual contract. And I guess at the time, and again, this is just something to think about, our understandings of church history, hopefully are as bad now as they ever will be, with the idea they're going to get better each day's time goes on. But that means 50 years ago, they were significantly worse than what they are now. So, In 1960, did most people believe that Joseph didn't do any of that money digging, didn't believe any of that magic stuff, didn't use a seer stone? Well, you can see how much things have changed. Not only does the church acknowledge that, they printed a picture of the stone. And that says everything about it. It says almost nothing about the artifacts, tells us volumes about who we are, what we believe, how we think about things.
Yeah. So he was, for being a murderer, he was a pretty smart guy too.
Well, had he not done all those forgeries, I don't, and this is my personal opinion. People have asked me, well, do you think you would ever murder anybody again? And I believe yes and no. My own thought of it. I believe no, because that is, he is not naturally that way. I mean, he sort of is now. But I believe yes, because someone told me this, and I hope that it's true, that oftentimes when a bear hurts or kills somebody, in Yellowstone Park, something like that, they have to put the bear down, because they say that once that bear gets the taste of blood in his mouth, he'll do it again and again and again. Well, I think that's Mark. He's done it once. And if he did not have a motivation to do it, I don't believe he would. He wouldn't go out and just kind of shoot somebody for no reason. But I believe he has the taste of that blood in his mouth. And so if he got himself into another situation where he was up a creek and didn't know what to do and was about again to be exposed, I mean, that's the reason he killed Stephen Christensen. He needed to put off, well, I don't know if I'll just go through this one. He had the Oath of a Freeman for sale in New York to the Library of Congress for $1.5 million. He had already sold off, unbeknownst to most people, almost anybody, he had already sold off part interest of his interest of that to other people for cash. He was supposed to go to New York on Friday of that week to sell off his last part interest in that.
The week of the bombing, or
week of the bombing.
Oh.
Now, he had gotten pressed, and he had to come up with that McLellin collection. And before that, he had been able to just put people off. I'll do it next week. I'll do it tomorrow. He was the king of that. Well, Stephen Christensen, and mainly because of that loan of First Interstate Bank, was not going to be put off. No. Mark, you can't tell me I'll do it in a week or something. We have got to go. And he said it was in a safe deposit box. And so they had to go to the bank when the bank was open. So that was a Monday. That was Columbus. No, it was the weekend. They couldn't go on Monday because that was a banking holiday. So they were supposed to go Tuesday. So Mark planted that bomb so that Steve would get that in the morning, and then he wouldn't have to go with Steve to the safety deposit box, in which was nothing. There was nothing in there. And that loomed so large in his view that he would literally do anything to get out of it. And I think an illustration here is appropriate. If you've been to seminary or stuff, often they'll do a little object lesson where they put a piece of string around your fingers, a piece of thread, and you break it, and that's easy, and then it gets harder and harder, and then pretty soon there's so many you can't do it. Well, that's why you shouldn't commit, sins, because, ones, and then you can't break it. That's not really, to me, a very valid illustration. The real illustration is where teenage kids all the time will wrap a piece of thread around their finger till it goes numb. And that's kind of funny, and see, it's numb, and it's starting to kind of turn red and blue, but then after a little bit, it starts to really hurt, and man, that thing comes off. Well, that's what Mark did, is he wrapped that around all of the lies, all of the forgeries, all of the promises. He just kept strapping that thing around and around and around till that thing hurt so bad he would do anything to get it off, including killing somebody. And so what was not, not really his nature, he didn't, he wasn't a murderous person. That hurt so bad, he'd do anything to get it off. And so he thought that if Stephen Christensen, and he didn't need to be killed, just need to be injured sufficiently that now he put packed nails in there and all that. So I know there's some like, well, you into killing? I am probably. I'm not talking about that, but it didn't need to be killed. He just needed to get some time. Because had he been able to get to New York on Friday, he could have come back with enough money to pay back that $185,000. Pressure would have been off. Steve showed up on his door, was going to show up on his door on Tuesday, and let's go. Well, then he was in real trouble because Hugh Pinnock had called him on Tuesday and said, well, the meeting's still on. We'll do it tomorrow. Mark was up, and that's the reason he was parked where he was. That wasn't just a random place to park. It was right down the street from the McCune mansion. And the attorney representing the guy that was going to purchase that McLellin collection, pay off the loan, his office was in the McCune mansion. And so Mark was right down to the last hour, minute, and second. He couldn't get out of it anymore. He was going to have to go up that road and say, I don't have it. Which he believed at that point the whole thing would unravel, and very well may have. Now, the bizarre part is, and again, just think about this the way you want to think about it. Why in the world didn't he just say, I forged this stuff? Oh, he would have been prosecuted. He would have gone to prison for, I don't know, what, 3, 4 years, 5 years? He'd be out now and maybe getting paid to detect forgeries. What is it in his head that turned? I don't know. I don't know if he knows. Maybe he does.
So that third bomb, the one that injured him. So one of the things that I heard, the differences were one with that killed Steve Christensen had nails.
That's correct.
The one that killed Kathy Sheets had nails. The one that injured him did not have nails.
Kathy Sheets did not have nails.
Oh, Kathy didn't have nails either?
Did not have nails.
Okay.
Only the first one.
Only the first one. So some people have speculated that he injured himself on purpose. Now, this is a new thing. I'm trying to remember. Kurt thought that it was meant for somebody else. I hadn't heard about this lawyer at the McCune mansion.
Yeah, no. People have said that. Oh, I think it was meant for me. If you just think about that, that simply couldn't be true. Because who in Salt Lake City on October 16th or 17th of 1985 would see Mark Hofmann and he would say, here's this package. Will you hold it for me? And nobody was picking up packages. UPS had pretty well shut down because nobody was picking up packages. The way he made those things work, and it's important to understand this, the way he made those things work is there was a battery on a rocket motor thing, for ignition in a pipe bomb, but it was on a mercury switch. And he had a little safety device in there so that just before he set it down, he pulled that safety out. But what he did is he wrote the address on the package and then put it face down. And so then when you saw the package, what is the natural thing everybody's going to do? Get it and turn it over, see what it's due. That trip the mercury switch, off it goes. Well, that's important because the third bomb was made in the same way. Now, here's what's impossible to know. Did he really gonna plant that at another person? Or I don't know. At that point, he may have been so irrational that's possible. But what in fact happened was he parked that car and I believe sat there for a period of time, I don't know, and thought, I am caught. I am caught. What do I do? He got out of the car. That bomb package was sitting on the driver's seat, and he made the assertion to power.
So you think he did it on purpose to injure himself?
Now, if he believed that he could have survived that, the car did burn, but there was enough papers and stuff in the trunk that had it burned completely, which it didn't, which cars don't, that only happens in the movies, he could have said, yes, McLellin collection right there. And who could have proved him wrong?
Right.
He could have come up with some crazy story about who put that bomb there, that he was really going up the office and they forgot something, came back, flipped the package over. So, does he regret what he did? No. And was he suicidal as I'm trying to repent of this? I don't think so. I think his hand is in the cookie jar and he's thinking still, how can I get out of this? How can I get out of this? Flip the package.
Well, if he flipped the package, then why is he going to make up this story about a brown van that hit him?
I think he was just telling people stuff.
You don't think he was just dazed from the explosion and was just like, oh, I don't know what happened?
I don't know. You know, afterwards, he told different stories to different people. And so I don't know. It's very confused. Was he telling one set of people it was the tan van, or was he telling other people that, you know, that there was a package on the seat? I don't know.
Well, and then you mentioned this McEwen mansion, that there was a lawyer that was going to buy it for the church?
No, for a guy named David Christensen, who at the time was a mission president of the Canada Halifax mission.
And so because you said...
I know this is... Okay, so I got to tell the truth here. Sorry. This is what happened. The church still wanted that collection badly, but they needed to figure out a way for them to take possession of that without officially taking possession of it. And I don't know who knew David Christensen, but he was very well-to-do, and somebody knew him well enough that they could make a phone call to him and say, look, there is this group of papers that we potentially would really like to have, but we are not in a position to make the purchase directly. So we need somebody to act as an intermediary. Would you do it?
Would you buy them?
Would you buy them?
And then
maybe in the future give them to us. But please know, or at least this is the way Dallin Oaks couched it, please know that we're not officially asking you, and we're making no warranty as to size, content, or authenticity, and we're going to just rely upon your generous spirit to give it in the future, maybe. Just know all of that. I don't know how those conversations really went. But the point was, even though Stephen Christensen had been put out of the picture, Mark believed that he now had, at least a week breathing room. Didn't last one day. Now, I don't know who representing the church was going to be there at that meeting with the attorney. It may have been Hugh Pinnock.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I've been reading Richard Turley's book, but it's been a while. I believe it was Hinckley, Oaks, Pinnock.
Those were the three that dealt with Mark on whatever a routine basis.
Right. Yeah, so I would assume those. I'm trying to remember who was the church historian. Was it Durham?
Well, G. Homer, no. I can't remember who it was at the time. It may have been G. Homer Durham.
Yeah, I think that
But Mark never really ever dealt with him. Don Schmidt was the guy that, that Mark worked with.
Okay.
Basically.
Yeah, and I'm sure Pinnock would have been there because he was the go-between with the bank and the bad loan.
Well,
so
he had a very serious invested interest in making sure that check was written, made to Mark, and that Mark did do nothing other than go immediately to First Interstate right down the street and endorse that check and pass it over. Because that's exactly the role that Stephen Christensen was playing there. He was just, he wasn't a document expert or anything like that. He had enough of a relationship with Mark that he could call Mark at home and go over to his house at 10 at night and knock on the door and get him to answer. And so that is the role that that he would have played. And so what I believed everyone assumed was that even though Stephen Christensen's now killed, the next day Mark is still going to go to the bank, empty that safe deposit box, and take it up to that office. But of course, Mark didn't have it. He had a few. Now, he did have some pieces. He did actually have some papyrus. So there could have been some pieces there, and that papyrus was actually in the trunk, and it was encased in some plastic, some Lexan, very nicely, because I did it. I put it in that plastic.
Where did you get the papyrus from?
Mark had purchased that about 6 months beforehand, and he had been showing that to people as evidence that there is a McLellin collection and there's real stuff. And it was real papyrus, not matching what the church owned, because it was from a different time period, and but it was very real papyrus.
Okay.
He bought it from Kenneth Rendell.
Oh, wow. And you mounted it in the plastic. Wow.
Now,
and that was in the trunk.
That meant that the forgeries were going to become, sooner or later they were going to come out. Because if he had passed that over to Steve Christensen, it was Kenneth Rendell that did the authentication of the Martin Harris letter. Who do you believe Steve Christensen would have gone to for an authentication of the McLellin collection? Kenneth Rendell. Included in that is papyrus. And Kenneth Rendell said, "Oh, that's real papyrus. I sold that to Mark Hofmann about 6 months ago." What? Again, the whole thing's exposed. The whole thing's exposed.
So, okay. Now, there was one other thing. There's no relationship between Dave Christensen and Steve Christensen. They're not related at all. But
unfortunate name, but no.
So do you think that third bomb may have been intended for Dave Christensen? Or you're...
Well, no. He was in Halifax, Canada at the time.
Oh, okay.
So that's another reason I don't know. But then part of the reason I don't know is, again, with our perspective, we look back and are looking for rationality and consistency. There was no rationality and consistency at the time. In fact, Mark was selling some forgeries in the month or so before the bombings, the 2 weeks. One of them was quite good, and two of them were really bad. I mean, they could have been detected in a second. But I think it just illustrates that he is not thinking really rationally. So we want to look back and say, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, yeah, it doesn't make sense. Some of the stuff that he was doing, but I think he was kind of out of his mind. I mean, he was doing stupid things, and not all the time, but he would do stupid things in the middle of that. And so some of that stuff, I mean, we look back on it and say, oh, we can see how that all played out, or maybe would play out. Mark couldn't see that. All he could see was the pressures that were coming on him very intensely. And he was just putting out fires any way he could. I mean, to think about the oath of a freeman, to sell off the last piece of interest you have in that, it's stupid, except he is putting out a fire with that money. So anyway, everything was done, but anyway, when you get back to that third bomb, I don't know if there was a rational reason for that. I just use all those of examples that there doesn't need to be a rational reason for it to have happened, because there was lots of irrational things. So who was that intended for? No idea. And maybe he didn't know who it was intended for until that day.
Well, and I noticed that you did show me, and I didn't read it as closely as I wanted to, but because in his, I don't know if you'd call that a confession or that document where he wrote to the parole board. Right. I do remember it said that he wasn't even sure why he had killed some of these people.
I would take that with some skepticism. I would take that with some skepticism, because this is now a full year after being in prison, and he is trying to present a picture to the parole board that he may get out someday. So I would be very suspect with anything that he says in there. It may be true. That's not to say that it is all necessarily lies. I hear that all the time. Well, you can't believe anything he says because he lies all the time. That's not true. He always lies when it's convenient and when it helps. But so there are a way to find out if he says a thing, if it's true, because if you can confirm it outside of him, then you could know that it was true. But anything like that, did he really not know who he was going to kill? Maybe I'm gonna maybe, because that's looking back, and because as it turns out, he's actually should have been out of prison a long time ago for what he was actually pled guilty to. There's a federal sentencing guideline matrix. It's actually a little chart. You can probably find it online, but it kind of puts on there what the crime is, prior conviction, stuff like that, and it comes up with 9.5 years. And the idea is that sentencing guidelines can be pretty uniform throughout the United States. His matrix, he would have been out in 9.5 years. He's not out. And I don't think he ever will.
It's been 20 years now, right, since he went to jail?
Well, it was 1987.
Yeah.
January of 1987. So yeah, 30 years.
30 years. 30 years.
30 years.
So you'd think I would do better with math.
Well, and then I can just follow up a little bit of that, because I talked about his mandatory review and we talked, his confession and all that. They were so put off with him that when they took all the information and then they deliberated and then they came back. I don't know if it's the same day or something, but they said, like I say, normally they'll say come back in a certain amount of time. They said, don't ever come back. Don't even waste the pencil lead. Don't ever come back. Now, I had occasion several years later, to talk to a guy who at the time was the head of the parole board. I was at a conference and he was there, and it turned out I could kind of take him aside and ask him a question. And I said, would you mind if I ask you a question about one of the prisoners? And he immediately said, oh, don't ask me because there's so many out there and I can't keep track of them all. And I said, I think you may remember this one. And so I told him, Mark Hofmann, oh, he knew that one. Yeah, he could remember that one. I said, is he ever going to get out? He said, as far as I understand, no. And he said, I'll tell you why. He said, the parole board turns over frequently. It's a very awful position, so people don't stay long periods of time. And so since it's such high turnover, there's no way for any group that's in at a particular time to know all the particulars of a case, especially as it gets older and older. As a result, he said, we rely heavily upon what was said and done at the time, with the belief that they are very familiar with the particulars and the nuances of it. And so then we just rely on them because we believe they know it much better than we do. So it's very difficult for us. It would take an extraordinary circumstance for us to countermand something that they did. And he said, and I have seen his, and he said, I can tell you as far as I'm concerned, all the time I'm here, never. He will die out here. Judd?
I think so.
Judd? He's of no value. The world does not need him. He can, even if he could contribute something. I know there's some people who are kind of bleeding hearts. Oh, he could become a contributing member. We don't need it. He needs to spend the rest of his life in jail. He needs to go out there, and however, and I actually I have no ill will toward him. I mean, I don't want to go throw rocks at him or to hurt him or something, but he needs to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, a lot of people, again, get confused, I think, because they think, oh, he got off easy. He got off bad. Because he went in at 30 or 32, which means that logically he will spend 50 or 60 years. And prison's not a good place. People say, oh, it's a country club. It's not a country club. So he gets to think about what he did for the rest of his life. And it's bad enough out there that he tried to commit suicide at least once and almost succeeded.
Do you remember the details around that?
Sure. He was out in maximum security. That was as a punitive measure. And he had collected sleeping pills from other inmates. They have a whole network of stuff that passes around in there. And so he collected sleeping pills, and he took everything that he had. But it was insufficient to kill him because he took those and then went all night. And then he was, he was in very poor shape. But then as the guards came around, someone noticed, that he hadn't moved. And so they went in, and so then he was rushed over to the infirmary and his stomach was pumped or whatever. I don't know. But then he was saved. So had he had more pills or been able to go longer, he may have succeeded. But it did damage him physically quite badly because the way he had laid on top of, and I can't remember which arm it is. Physically, he is not in great shape these days because from the bombing, he had a severe injury to one of his knees. He's missing kind of part of the fingers on one hand where he flipped that thing over. There's a lot of damage to one of the arms, and then, he has some scars around. And then from laying there, he had laid on his arm, and it's like when when your arm goes to sleep or your hand goes to sleep and it hurts and you wake up, it hurts real bad. Well, of course, he never woke up. And so it wrecked the tissue on one of his hands and arms quite badly. So when you see him, one arm there's scars, but one arm's all real skinny because he lost quite a bit of the flesh off the hand as a result.
I know in the book Salamander, one of the policemen or detectives, I'm not sure which, said that the hand that did the forging has been permanently damaged.
That may be.
Yeah.
That may be. That's a curiosity. I wonder if it would make any difference. I don't know.
All right. So a couple other questions. I know we've been talking a long time, but this is really fascinating to get such an up-close view of this whole thing. Have you had any correspondence with Mark in prison or anything? Or
yes, for about a year or so, I would when I was living here in Utah, I went out and visited him. I don't remember how many times, probably 6 or 7, 8, something like that. And then wrote back and forth at that same time period. And I had no contact with him before that, and then I've had nothing since that. So there was just a short, relatively short period of time that.
So you met with him 6 times, and you corresponded. That was soon after he went to prison, and you haven't done it for a while, or
no? That was 1991, 92.
Okay, so that was about 5 years after he went in.
Yeah.
And so you met with him a few times. Is that something you can talk about?
Yeah. I can just give you my impressions.
Mm-hmm.
The first time he was over in the maximum security section, and it was in what they call a barrier visit, so that you're behind glass and you're just talking through a telephone, that sort of a thing. Somebody's listening in on the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
He normally, I saw the visiting list for him when I was out there one time, and it only consisted at that time of me and then family members. And there was a list of probably 10 or 12 family members, most of which never went. They were an aunt or an uncle, something like that. At that time, it was just, his wife went out there quite a bit regularly in the first year or year and a half. And then she stopped. Then his parents would go out, and I actually met them one time, kind of as they were coming out and I was going in. And then they would take his kids one at a time, because you could only ever have a maximum of 3 people at a time. So it could be his parents and one child. The next time, one child. His father passed away some years after that. I understand his mother is still living. I don't know if she visits him very much. And I believe it's just his children. And I don't know if all of them are Just some of them go out and how frequently. Some of them, his oldest son lives in the Denver, Colorado area, so it couldn't be that often. But he didn't have very many visitors. But I did find out that Gary Sheets went one time. And I mean, you're able to show that, the correspondence for that. But I have no idea what was said. No idea. And I can't imagine what that would have been like. Though actually for Mark, I don't believe that would have been the worst encounter he had of that nature. The reason I say that is after he had decided to plead guilty, and there was a time gap between signing a document with the prosecutors and the defense attorneys and him, January 7th, and then him actually going to court, which was either January 22nd or 23rd, that he just went back home, and I don't know what he told his wife. I can't imagine. I'm going to prison, but I didn't do it. The whole thing just boggles the mind. But one of the things that Ron Yangich required of him was that he tell his dad what he really had done, because his dad had gone more than the extra mile in supporting his son. And he never said, I think he's innocent, or, it was, he never, was involved in that sort of thing, but he always went to court with him, and, and his parents were just, like I say, they went the extra mile. And he had been telling his parents that he hadn't done it. And so he made Mark tell his dad in Ron's office. How do you, as a parent, how do you live with that? Anyway, that would have been the worst, I think. Anyway, but anyway, not many people visited him, but they did for a short period of time. But anyway, every time after that, he'd been moved over to medium security, and it was not a barrier visit. And my point there was just to be friendly, be a nice person, let him have somebody to talk to, and see what I can find out. And so I would ask him questions. I wasn't able to record anything, couldn't take a paper or pencil in, so what I would do is go out and sit in my car in the parking lot and write it down as fast as I could. That was where I found out about something, because at some point someone was watching this, they think, how does he know about all this stuff? Well, it's been in the ensuing years, in books, in talking with Mark and talking with other people. That's kind of how you found out about stuff. The interviews that he did, I have a set of those. I went down to the county attorney's office and bought a set when they were available.
Oh, are they? Because I was looking for that. I know Steve Mayfield, he's kind of a collector of this kind of stuff. And I haven't been able to figure out where to find those. Do you know where to go?
They're very difficult. It was very limited edition. Limited run. Uh-huh. And they're just in the hands of private people. So if you ask me now, I'll let you borrow them.
All right, I'll have to.
And they're all numbered. And they even got a little camera coverage when I got there.
Wow.
Because all that they had were gone in one day, because everybody wanted them went zooming down. And so the news had set up some cameras and and so I got.
Wow.
So anyway, through stuff like that, you find out a lot of things, but I found out a number of things. And one of the things that was news to me, because at that time I didn't know this, was the self-hypnosis. And he told me at the time that to him had become his religion. He said, I practice that every day. I do some relaxation. I hypnotize myself almost every day.
So that's probably what required in order to be such a cool customer with all these people, was self-hypnosis every day?
Well, if it ever came to a pinch, he would be able to do that. I don't know that I think by the time I knew him, he didn't need to do that to lie anymore. That just came out of his head, just as natural as you and I speaking. Now, he did have quirks and eccentricities. eccentricities. Okay, I'll take that pronunciation. His car was a mess all the time, papers and stuff. And if he didn't want you to see something, he'd go, "Oh, I don't want you to see that," and he'd grab it, put it down the side so you can see it. He compartmentalized a lot. How he was able to keep track of that, I don't know. And I think sometimes he didn't. People would catch him in little lies, or he had told them, "Oh, yeah, I have this thing and I'll sell it to you." And then a month later, he had forgotten and sold it to somebody else. But he'd just make up a story, So I don't think he was able to keep it all going, but he was able to keep a lot of balls in the air at the same time and tell different people different stories. He just seemed like he was just a convict. I mean, he had accustomed himself to the convict life. I mean, there's a certain rhythm and cadence to that place, and if you want to survive, you got to get into that cadence and rhythm. And evidently, he ranks pretty high on the interesting or cool scale in prison. If you can imagine there's such a thing, evidently there is. And evidently people that are murderers or that have taken advantage of big institutions, the state or the church, rank pretty high. And so he's pretty high. He told me that pedophiles are the very bottom of the list. And they are regularly targeted for abuse, for sexual abuse, for beatings, And when he told me that, he pointed out a guy that was at another table. And he said they call them rapos. He says, "It's a rapo right over there." And he was sitting there, and his wife and child was there, and they were trying to pretend like it was a normal day in the park. And just now, after 30 years, I don't know. I don't know what he's like. I mean, I can't even imagine. Other than he's just continued in that convict, get along in the criminal system world. I think he still harbors an idea that he'll get out someday, and I believe that's what drives most of his denials of talking to anybody. Corresponding with news people or anything like that.
Oh, so you think that he doesn't want to do interviews because he wants to still get out? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. See, his attorney was Ron Yengich, and Ron Yengich also defended the Ogden Hi-Fi murderers, Shelby and whatever, I can't remember, in things that they had said in prison, speaking when they shouldn't have, not being careful, were used against them in their commutation hearings and their death. I mean, and then, when they made appeals for commutation of sentence or to have the death penalty removed. And so Ron instructed him carefully, do not talk about your crimes. Do not give any new information, because that information could be then used against you, if you were come up for parole. And so he has taken that seriously and rarely, if ever, says what he did. I think that handwritten thing to the parole board is far and away the most complete and comprehensive and as honest as you could get of him really confessing up to what he did. But I believe a careful reading of that would reveal nothing that was not already known.
Mm-hmm. So, now you mentioned Ron Yengich. You said that he even lied to him.
Evidently did to begin with. Told him, no, I didn't do any of this stuff. Didn't forge, didn't kill those people. I don't know if Ron believed that. I mean, Ron's way too smart. Has been around this way too long to not,
So, do you know what happened?
Now, but I would have to say that at some point then Ron did figure it out, or he was told, because then they went into the plea bargain negotiations, because going to trial, well, for both sides, and I should say something about that right now, I think Mark got as harsh of a sentence that he would have gotten had he gone to trial. I don't believe that a death penalty would have ever been agreed on with a jury, because he had no priors. I mean, he just didn't fit that kind of multiple offender sort of thing. Now, the crimes were callous, heinous, and multiple, maybe, but I don't believe. So if that had not been the case, he would have just gotten life in prison. Well, he's got that anyway. See, now I can't remember what it was, but anyway, I think the sentence, I think Ron did as good a job for him as he could have done, because I don't believe the prosecutors would have accepted anything less than at least the possibility of life in prison. And he only had that on one of the counts. The way that plea bargain actually worked, he pled guilty on 4 counts, 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of theft by deception. And in the plea agreement, they agreed to dismiss all other counts that they had brought, and federal counts on the machine gun, and something about the Library of Congress I read. So they dismissed all the rest of that, so that the only thing that would pend against him was the Utah charges and staying in Utah State Prison. And unless something really strange happens, he will have ended up getting a life sentence. But obviously at some point, then Ron said, well, obviously you did this, so we don't want to go to trial, so let's see what we can do. And I was told a couple of years later, it was actually at a Christmas party that Ron Yangich and Bob Stott were at. And they kind of just stepped to the side and said, okay, what if he pleads guilty? Well, they kind of hammered down the basic idea right there.
Well, because the interesting thing is, because I know you told me before we started recording that he had lied to, he said, there's the person you don't lie to is your lawyer. But he had lied to Ron Yangich and said he didn't do it. I guess what's interesting is I know that there was a confession to a nurse, or I don't know if it was to the nurse, but she had overheard something that sounded like he had admitted to it. Uh-huh. And I know that Ron Yangich got that suppressed.
Oh, man. He went ape. He went ballistic in making sure that information never, saw the light of day. Now, to this day, I still don't know what he said. It's very odd. I since he's in prison, I wonder if the nurse, if you could ever find her, if she would say.
Yeah, that would be
interesting. We'd all love to know, wouldn't we? What is it that he said? Because what happened was she did not mention it. There was a policeman standing by, but he couldn't hear it. But he could see that he had waved to her, and then he was speaking like to her ear. And so, man, he went, what is he saying? And that's where it all arose from. And then Ron found out about that because Ron had, when he was in the hospital, and here's another story. Wow. Mark's in the hospital, and I go up there to LDS Hospital the day after, 2 days after at the most. And his family, his wife is up there. And again, I'm up there and I'm thinking, wow, this is crazy. And we all believe Mark has just been a victim. And well, Ron Yangich and his partner, Brad Rich, came over while I was there. I spent 1/2 of a day there, about 4 hours. And they came in, and so they had been retained, and it was somebody in the hospital that told Mark Hofmann's dad, you need to call Ron Yangich. That's the person to get, because they didn't know anything about criminal lawyers or, that's the person you need to get. And so they called him, and he came over. And so he was just brand new to this and just like, okay, what is going on? And he started asking questions. And again, Ron is not dumb. Very probing questions about who Mark was and what his, personality was and so on and so forth. And I was the one that had to sit there and tell in front of his wife and parents, Mark's total atheist, hasn't believed in the church in years. So not only is their husband blown up, dying, they get to hear that all of his church stuff is just out the window. Nuts. But he was at the hospital a lot. And so when he heard that, man, he raced immediately and claimed doctor-patient privilege. And that was the sticking point. Had it been a medical doctor that he was whispering or talking to, there wouldn't have been any fight. But the nurse, does she qualify? Well, he successfully argued that umbrella stretches wide enough to include an emergency room nurse. A CNA or something, maybe not, but an emergency room nurse. But to this day, he may have just said, my leg hurts. We don't know. The assumption is that because someone said he wanted a tape recorder because he wanted to say something because he thought he was going to die. I really think he was going to die? I don't know. I don't know. And for all we know, it was going to be, I think I'm going to die. I didn't do any of this stuff. We don't know that it would have been a confession to crimes. We assume so, but that may not be true.
All right. Well, I think I'm out of questions finally. Is there anything that I've missed? Is there anything you want to add to this story?
None in particular. We could just go on forever. So, maybe I have to do part 2 or something.
Yeah, we might have to do a part 2. So you've got some interesting documents. I've taken a few pictures of some of them.
I can say something because this has bothered me forever. I have heard I've seen surveys done where people have left the LDS church and they rank, what was the number 1 thing that made you leave, number 2, number 3. And I've seen it where there's a list of 20 things. It always amazes me when I see Mark Hofmann bombings or whatever mentioned. And I have thought, why would that make you leave the church? And then eventually I got it that it put people off because they could not understand why the general authorities did not detect somehow that he was untruthful or these were forgeries or whatever. Well, I just recently reread a talk that Dallin Oaks gave at BYU, I think in 1987 or 87, where he talked about that a little bit. But being in the position that he is, I don't think he was able to tell the real reason. His reasoning, what he said is that we don't go into transactions with people suspecting everybody. We try to have a good attitude and, assume that not everybody's out to get us. And so we went into it with the same, we're not naturally suspicious or naturally think everybody's bad. And that's true, but that was true for everybody. No one. Kurt Bench, anybody. Brent Ashworth. Brent Ashworth had been dealt very badly by Mark. He had been promised things and Mark didn't come through, and had sold things to other people where he had been promised. And so he had a number of bad dealings with Mark. But still, he still did business with him and still, and still considered him somewhat, friendly. So everybody was that way. But I think what he was unable to say is those guys don't have magic powers. And people in the church want to believe that. Unfortunately, they're taught that. Church education system is one of the worst offenders. I've actually seen written in books where they're talking about general authorities and use the phrase, they can see around corners. That is not true. That is not true in any shape or form. But if you're told that when you're 14 years old and going to seminary, you believe it. And you keep believing that your whole life. It's not true. They have no more ability to detect a murderer in front of them or a forger or anything else than anybody else does. They have the same capacity to look and investigate and think about things rationally, than anybody else does. But the thought that they can just cock their ear and Jesus will tell them. And if that becomes the reason you quit the church, I think it's one of the dumbest reasons on earth. Anyway, thank you. I feel better now.
All right. Well, thanks. I really appreciate you spending some time here on Gospel Tangents, and I hope things go well. And we'll see. I may have to call you again, and we'll talk about this some more.
Sure.
All right. Thanks again.
Okay.
If you'd like to hear the entire conversation without any interruptions, sign up at patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire video or audio uncut, whichever you'd like. So this is part of the Gospel Tangents podcast network, and so please sign up today and support Gospel Tangents.